Hi, everyone. That was for Jared. He's from New York. I'm Kevin Barenblatt, co-founder of Fast Forward, and I can't believe it, but today is our final class for our Fast Forward Academy. For those of you who have joined us for one of the first 7 classes, welcome back. I see some familiar faces on the Zoom, and if this is your first class, welcome. Today, I'm so excited you get to meet Jared Chung from careervillage.org. He's going to talk about how to get free help for your tech nonprofit. Serendipitously, this week is National Volunteer Week, so it's the perfect time to learn how to attract and manage volunteers for your nonprofit. First, a bit on Fast Forward. We believe the best tech should be applied to our biggest social problems, and that's why we focus exclusively on helping tech nonprofits scale. Our main program is a tech accelerator for nonprofits. We've had 59 organizations go through our program, and those organizations have gone on to raise hundreds of millions of dollars in follow-on funding and impact more than 88 million lives. We just closed applications for this summer's program, but if you're just hearing about it and know the perfect tech nonprofit, or if you are the perfect tech nonprofit, then please let us know. Before we get started, some norms for today's class. The class is being recorded. We're going to send out the recording after the class, and you can actually also check out other class recordings on our YouTube page. Please stay on mute when you're not speaking. After Jared's talk, we're going to do Q&A, and you can use the raise your hand feature to ask questions. If you don't see it, you can just chat, use the chat feature to let us know that you have a question. And please share us on social. We'd love to hear from you. Today's class, the Fast Forward Academy, was made possible by eBay Foundation and Comcast Business. So a huge thank you for their support. And we also want to thank our sustaining premier partners. These are Google.org, BlackRock, HPE Foundation, Twilio.org, GM, and Okta. Many thanks for your support. As a special treat to you, today, if you stay to the end, you have a chance to win an eBay gift card. All right, now for the good stuff. I'm thrilled to introduce you to our final Academy teacher, Jared Chung. He is the founder and executive director at careervillage.org, which is a tech nonprofit that went through our accelerator in 2015. Jared's been an indispensable part of our community ever since. Millions of students lack access to the world of work and answers about their future career paths. And careervillage.org's mission is to democratize access to career advice for underserved youth. Amazingly, careervillage.org has now served over 5 million young people searching for career information. For the first few years, recruiting volunteers took a lot of Jared's time and was difficult to manage. However, Jared has now built a sustainable earned income revenue model around volunteering. And now careervillage.org has engaged over 85,000 crowdsourcing volunteers and 5,000 pro bono volunteers. As you may have noticed from the intro, Jared's a New Yorker. He's an alum of McKinsey, and he's an expert at recruiting free help and managing it well. So with that, I'm excited to pass it to him.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kevin. Everybody can hear me okay? Yes, awesome. Thank you. So I'm really thankful to be here with you all today. I'm a big fan of Fast Forward and a huge beneficiary of the Fast Forward program. I also see a lot of familiar faces, including friends and family. So I see you and thank you for joining. I want to take a moment to share a portion of my screen here. So let me see if we can get this going. Okay, awesome. So the topic today is how to get help and how to manage it well. And I'm going to be drawing upon my experiences with careervillage.org, but also drawing upon what I've seen work really well from other nonprofit organizations and other communities that are similarly inclined. For the most of this presentation, I'm going to be taking the perspective of a nonprofit organization or a community organizer. Now, if you are not representing a nonprofit or you're not a community organizer, you still might be able to get a lot out of this presentation, but you're going to have to do a little bit of the translation work to figure out how it fits into your perspective if you work at a company or if you are a individual volunteer, for example. So from the perspective of an individual organization, of a nonprofit or a community organization, um, I'm zeroing in on a couple of objectives that we tend to have. The first objective is to tap into the goodwill of people to support the mission. And the second objective is to make sure that we manage the support so that it's worth our time and our organization's time to manage. And what I've found over time is that there are definitely ways that this can be done well, and there are many pitfalls you can fall into that can make it so that managing the volunteer time ends up being a negative ROI. And so that's what I'm hoping to share with you all today, and to discuss with you, and frankly, also to get your feedback on. Now, I think there are some things about this that are very hard, and I wanted to start with the kind of underlying premises or assumptions I'm making as we go into this. I'm calling them the 3 hard truths. The first truth is that staff attention tends to be the most scarce resource for a nonprofit or community organization. In this case, staff could mean the employees of the nonprofit. If you're a entirely volunteer run organization, you might think of staff as the core team. But no matter what, whether we think of all the different resources you have at your disposal, I found that when I'm meeting with other executive directors, we tend to be talking about staff capacity first and foremost as what's the most scarce. Even money is put into context of how that unlocks staff capacity. The second is that volunteers require staff attention to recruit, to manage, to support, to engage and re-engage. And then the third, which may be a little controversial sometimes, but I think I've found is almost always the case, is that volunteers are unpredictable. They are whole people with entire lives. They have jobs and families and hobbies. And when they come into a volunteer activity, they're thinking of themselves in the best version of themselves that they can be. And that leads them to optimism, and sometimes life gets in the way. And this is understandable. But how do you manage unpredictable volunteers that require staff attention when staff attention is your scarcest resource? So that's really the primary challenge that I'm working to try to tackle here in this talk. How can we get the most out of volunteer support without overtaxing our staff? Now, I'm going to give you the answer right up front, and then I'll jump into the components of it. The basic answer is that you have to be really explicit about the type of contributions that you want from your volunteers. And you categorize them in a particular way, which I'm going to share in a moment. If you categorize them in that way, then you'll use a very different management strategy depending on the type of volunteer contribution you're looking for. And I'm calling those strategies the 4 sources. So the first thing, to illuminate this a little bit, what kind of contributions do you need? There are 2 axes in which I'd like you to consider classifying your contributions. The first axis is, are the contributions simple or easy? In this case, meaning that it's maybe one or a small number of steps. Maybe it doesn't require much effort or time. And complex or hard, meaning that it requires many steps or is undefined or requires great effort or great investment of time. And then the second axis is, do you need very few contributions, which might be a dozen over the course of a year, or do you need many, hundreds of thousands of contributions or millions of contributions over the course of a year? And obviously these are scales, and so you may find yourself in gray zones. But what I found is that this really changes a huge impact on the strategy that you want to use. So in the bottom left, if you have a small number of really simple or really easy contributions, the strategy I'd recommend you use is insourcing. And to explain that in one line, don't pass that to volunteers. It tends to not even be worth the communication overhead to engage volunteers in a small number of simple tasks. You might spend more time writing the email or trying to get on a phone call than it would actually take you to do it yourself with a staff investment. So we insource there. Moving up, what if you have a very large number of simple or easy contributions that you need to execute? In that case, the source that you want to use is crowdsourcing. I'm going to dig into that one much more in a few minutes. On the bottom right, if you have a small number of really complex or really hard tasks, Then you look at outsourcing. And this is going to be a lot like if you were outsourcing core staff work to a contractor or to a third-party agency. You want to manage your volunteers in sort of a similar fashion. Again, I'll dig into that more in a few minutes. And then in the top right, the danger zone. Complex, hard tasks that you need done all year long at high volume. This is not a great place to be. And if you can get out of it, I'd recommend trying to get out of it, working your way to the left or working your way down. But if you have to be up there, you can still succeed. And there are many organizations that do a great job in the top right quadrant. That strategy is called resourcing. And as it sounds, you're going to have to spend a lot of resources to make sure you manage that well. We'll get into that one as well. I'm going to jump now straight to the crowdsourcing example. I'm not going to spend much time on insourcing because it's not really about volunteer management. So once again, crowdsourcing is a situation where you have many simple tasks to complete. When you want to use it is when you have a large number of qualified people. So if it's a rare skill that you need to execute, you probably are going to have trouble crowdsourcing. You need a large number of people who are qualified to execute the task. In addition, it's a good thing to use when you have parallelizable work. If your contributions can all be done at the same time, or if they could be done out of sequence in any way asynchronously, then you might look at crowdsourcing as a good option. What you wouldn't want, or what might make your job a little harder, is if your tasks require sort of a predefined sequence and you have to pass work from one person to another over a long chain. That would make your job of crowdsourcing a little bit less applicable. Verification is easy. For verification, we're talking about just simply verifying that the work got done. It could be as simple as they submitted a form, or they hit submit, or they sent it to an email address. But if verification is really easy and doesn't require staff attention, then crowdsourcing is going to be easier. And lastly, synergy. Now here I'm using the textbook definition of synergy, meaning that the value of the sum is greater than the value of the individual components added up. A great example of this would be something like Wikipedia, where the individual edits have a certain amount of value. And if you add them all up together, you get some value to society. But bringing them together into one place brings trust and credibility and creates additional engagement. That's synergy where crowdsourcing can make a lot of sense. And obviously the reason why crowdsourcing works well is because it leverages staff time across a large number of people. Now, the keys to doing it well, I've found 5. The first is you have simple and consistent messaging. And in the context of Career Village, which once again is an organization that helps young people get career advice by crowdsourcing career advice for them, for us, that's a really simple message to volunteers. We need you to answer one question from one young person who's interested in your job. That's a simple message. We keep it consistent. Now, it's also not the full message. There are 17 other ways you could volunteer on Career Village, but we don't muddy the messaging with all that additional complexity. We keep it real simple. The very first thing we want you to do, we want you to hear that loud and clear. And when you're in, you've taken your first action, sure, we might hit you up with other asks for other things. We keep that first message real simple. Minimizing friction. Now for this one, you really want to make sure if you're crowdsourcing a large number that it's really easy to do, each time, if somebody's doing it their first time or their 100th time, that it's a really simple interaction for them that doesn't require a lot of steps or a lot of extra irrelevant work. Minimizing training is super valuable if you're crowdsourcing. Think of training in terms of seconds or minutes. Sometimes you might get yourself to hours, but you really want to avoid anything that goes beyond that. At Career Village, there's almost no training required at all because we've refined the task down to a really simple thing, a question about your occupation. If you know the answer, answer it. If you don't, then don't answer it. So the training required is really minimal. There is no scheduled training, but when you register, we show just a couple of screens in the onboarding that give you a couple of hints of things we want you to know about the application. But other than that, there's really no required training to get started. Now, the minimizing friction and minimizing training might lead you to have to build customized tooling. And from what I've seen, most organizations that do crowdsourcing really well end up at some point having to do custom tooling. In our case, it's an entirely custom web application and other back-end administrative tools that we have to build fully custom to suit our workflows and to minimize friction and training. And then lastly, making sure that you don't have a one-to-one interaction where possible between what a volunteer does and what a staff member has to do. Ideally, everything you're doing from communication to verification to management happens in large groups or in a one-to-many interaction. Now, I'm going to show some examples from Career Village in a minute, but I just want to give a quick shout out to a couple of other organizations that I think do this really well. Be My Eyes is a nonprofit organization that allows sighted volunteers to serve as surrogate eyes for people who are visually impaired. And that's all done through a custom application on a mobile phone. Wikipedia, we all know quite well, does this extremely well. OpenStreetMap takes the work of creating and updating and analyzing maps and reduce those to really small tasks that a large number of volunteers can contribute to. And Tarjimli, another Fast Forward alum organization, allows multilingual volunteers to serve as translators for a wide variety of types of beneficiaries. And they've all done a great job with crowdsourcing. Two quick examples from Career Village. For those who haven't seen the application itself, as a volunteer answering a career question, the basic steps are looking for a question to answer on the left side, in the middle, reading the question, clicking the answer button, and then filling out the form and hitting the submit button. Now, there's other little stuff you can add in here and there, but for the most part, that's it. It's very low friction interaction. Now, it used to be when folks would volunteer with us, they'd be creating a huge amount of content. And we would have all of our staff members involved in managing and moderating and reviewing that content to ensure that it was appropriate for the site. We call that activity moderation, and we did it by hand. Over time, it was sort of, because it broke the no one-to-one rule, it became unscalable. And we decided to build a custom application that took the work of moderation and brought it into a custom Slack app that a group of trained volunteer moderators could distribute amongst themselves. And this is how it works. You can see on the right side, a moderator scrolling through the Slack app and reviewing the content created by volunteers, clicking the approve button to approve content or the reject button as appropriate to mark something as inappropriate for it to be to be processed and handled by a staff member. And this works extremely well. So far, our moderators have altogether moderated over 400,000 pieces of content on average in under 5 hours. That's an incredible feat. They have flagged 12,000 pieces of content for action by a staff member. I strongly recommend, if anybody's interested in how this works, we have open sourced the code for it. You're welcome to go check it out after this session. Now I'm going to move off of crowdsourcing to the outsourcing, which is the bottom right quadrant of the 4 sources. So when would you use outsourcing? When you have a small number of difficult, but also really high value tasks. Obviously, nobody really wants to do a small number of really difficult and low value tasks. So you want to make sure that what you're doing is really high value. If there's a small number of people qualified with the skills or knowledge, it's specialty knowledge or specialty skills that your staff just doesn't have, then you might look at outsourcing. And obviously it works because it gets things done that you just can't do on your own. And therefore it's worth it for you to invest the communication overhead to manage the outsourced work. I chose the word outsourcing really carefully, intentionally, because in many ways it mirrors outsourcing that you might do to take regular staff work and hire a contractor. And what makes it work well tends to be somewhat similar. There are 5 keys we've identified to doing it well. The first is making sure that you document everything in the process so that if others have to come in and adopt the work, that they can see what's been done in the past. That could be in a wiki or a Notion page or in Google Docs or wherever it is that you keep documents and documentation. But it's really important with something like outsourcing to do that well. Now, the next one, just-in-time investment, is actually not something you would normally do if you were outsourcing a project to an agency. With an agency or a contractor, you might gather together everything they might want to know and give it to them on day one. But when you're working with volunteers who are inherently unpredictable and potentially unreliable, you really don't want to do that. Investing everything up front and giving them everything they might need runs the risk that someone gets halfway through your project and then unfortunately has life come up and they're unable to finish the work. So instead, we've adopted a strategy where we do just-in-time investment. We give volunteers what they need when they need it. We would rather have that approach and not run the risk of investing too much and then having a project stop or fail than the alternative. It's especially important when you're working with a contractor or an agency to have clear deliverables, and that's even more so true when you're working with outsourcing strategy for volunteerism. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later when I highlight Catchafir's menu. The fourth is having a little bit of friction. You don't want to have a lot of friction at the end of a project when you're outsourcing, but at the beginning, it's actually not that bad. Now, I wouldn't introduce artificial friction, but having a volunteer who's about to do a hard thing or a complex thing show you that they are really serious about it by jumping over a small hurdle in the first 10 minutes is, in our experience, is tended to be very, very good predictor of who's actually able to finish a project. If someone is not able to overcome a small bit of friction at the beginning of an outsourcing style project, they might be better suited to crowdsourcing kind of interaction, but not really something that's complex or hard to do. And then lastly, your role as a manager of staff members is very close communication and coordination. But when you're working with outsourced volunteers, you probably would want to think of yourself more like a maintainer of an open source project, where you're coordinating and you're checking the quality of the work, but you're not really doing day-to-day, hour-to-hour management. Not that anyone really would want to do hour-to-hour micromanagement, but you definitely want to veer clear of that when it comes to volunteerism. And I think there are two families of organizations that do this really well that I wanted to highlight. The first family are pro bono management organizations. Fast Forward does a fair amount of this and it does it really well. Catchafir is an organization that helps nonprofits get connected to pro bono volunteers with a menu of very structured projects, which I'm going to show later. And I think it's a great menu to refer to, whether you're doing a Catchafir project or not. Full Circle Fund is an accelerator that we also went through that we had a great experience with, but I wanted to highlight as well because they do something very special with organizing their pro bono, which is that they train their pro bono volunteers with a power and privilege training. I think it really is an interesting starting point for a pro bono project to do a power and privilege training that essentially gets volunteers to think maybe a little bit differently about their relationship to the nonprofit and even about things like what's the value of time. And then the other family is open source software. Python and Django are two open source software program communities that I know well, and they do a great job of managing their community. I'd like to assert that these are really not crowdsourcing initiatives. They're really more like outsourcing initiatives. It's also a cautionary tale when you look at open source software. There are a lot of projects out there that are not in healthy shape and don't do well, where maintainers end up burning out. And I think if you are into open source software, thinking about why some projects succeed and some lead to maintainer burnout is very educational for thinking about this strategy. One example I want to highlight is Career Village's How to Help page. If you're in front of your computer right now, you could go to bit.ly/helpcv and look at this page yourself. It's a Notion page which allows our staff to quickly edit the page. And what's important about it is you'll see at the bottom, we've listed a huge number of really small mini projects, anywhere from a few hours to a few weeks. We don't list projects that are a few months long. That's too much risk to put on the back of an individual volunteer. But smaller projects, it's fair game. And what I think you'll notice when you look at it is that there is a little bit of friction here. because we haven't really clarified everything about these projects. We'll often get an email from somebody who says, hey, I'm really interested in project number 77, but there's nothing there but a single line. And that's on purpose. We'll say, I'm so glad you asked. Here's a little bit more information. Do you remain interested or not? And that's in making sure that we do just-in-time investment. It's also making sure that they have just a tiny bit of reasonable friction to make sure that they're seriously interested in the project. And sometimes they'll say, I'm interested in 6 projects. We say, here's what they are in 1 paragraph or less. And they'll say, you know what, I'm actually only interested in 1 now. And that's fine. We didn't overinvest in that. And it's a good use of our time. And it's allowed us to make this kind of help much more manageable for us. I alluded to Catch a Fire's menu. I want to encourage you all to go look at that at some point. One thing that I really like about this is whether you use a Catch a Fire pro bono team or not, being able to look at the project plans with specific deliverables, with specific timelines and milestones is really helpful if you plan to run a pro bono project on your own. So I definitely encourage that, referring to the menu. Okay, now we're going to move to the danger zone. So resource. This is the area where you have a large number of really complex or difficult tasks. And this is the last of the 4 sources I'm going to cover. And after that, we'll move to Q&A. So you want to use this when really you just can't get away with crowdsourcing or outsourcing. You have no choice essentially but to be in the top right quadrant. The other time you might want to use this is if the act of volunteering itself is the impact you're trying to create. That's a unique but very powerful model. And that's another time when you might find yourself in this quadrant where you wouldn't want to do the other ones because it's the volunteering itself that changes minds or builds skills or something like that. And the reason it works is frankly just that you're able to unlock skills at a larger scale than you ever could have otherwise organized. So the keys to doing this well here are pretty tricky. There's a lot of strategies. One strategy is federation, creating lots of small organizations under sort of a federal system with top-down management or bottom-up collaboration to distribute the work of managing people and managing complex projects down through a pyramid, if you will. I have on the right-hand side here the Boy Scouts of America, which is a good example of a very federated model, but there are many of them. Credentialing becomes an issue, making sure that people are qualified to do the work or that the completion of a complex task is verified. You might solve that with something like badging or certificates or graduation ceremonies, things like that. Monitoring is really important. You start to get with the complex, difficult tasks, you start to get into more issues of quality. And so then you have to invest a lot of time in staff-based monitoring or peer monitoring. And then the last one, I just don't see any way you can really get out of having to tackle the fact that you're going to need money and staff. Now, if you're really good at self-organizing, you could potentially run a large program like this with a volunteer-led org structure, and some organizations do that well. But that's another level of difficulty. So if you have the ability to raise money for something like this, then it can serve you well. Crisis Text Line is a really good example of resource. They're doing hard work intervening in moments of huge crisis for individuals. They have to do a lot of training. They build custom tooling, so you might argue that they're trying to move their way out of resource and potentially toward crowdsource. But it does take 30 hours of training to qualify to be a crisis counselor. So it's definitely a significant investment of time. Right, here we go. So there's an application and a background check, the training. You have to commit to a certain number of hours. And then Crisis Text Line has published that it actually costs them quite a lot of money to train counselors. So it's a big investment. Now, the Boy Scouts has this really significant org chart, a national council, groups and divisions and regions and areas within which there are chartered orgs, which are broken up into units and troops. And at the very bottom, you have scouts. And this gigantic org chart really, I think, represents how they've taken the work of the volunteering itself or the service itself being educational, and found a way to make that manageable at large scale. And then on the right-hand side, Lawyers Clearinghouse in Massachusetts is the organization that helped Career Village to find its pro bono lawyers when we wanted to get 501c3 certification. And they serve as a clearinghouse between these really skilled lawyers and the nonprofit beneficiaries who need it. And so they kind of jumped in and said, let's be that org chart that manages and checks quality on the pro bono work that's being done downstream. So those are the 4 sources. Now, there are a couple tricky bits, and I'm not going to go through all of them in great detail here, but these could be things we discuss in Q&A if they interest you. I haven't talked about where to find the volunteers. And at Career Village, I'll just tell you right now that there tend to be a large number of volunteers out there looking for a way to give back. We find them on LinkedIn. We find them at Volunteer Match. Some of them are Googling their way for volunteer opportunities and find us as well. And then we also find volunteers to a great extent through corporate partners. And as Kevin alluded to at the beginning, we have created a managed volunteer program that we offer to corporations who end up also becoming grant partners or funders of our core work. That's a big source of where we get our volunteers. You might ask how many is many, how complex is complex. Obviously, it's difficult and it depends. I think I want to remind you that the Full Circle Fund Power and Privilege training is one strategy to explain the scarcity of staff time to volunteers, but you might encounter other ways you want to go about introducing this idea that where volunteers can be most helpful is when they help us multiply our scarcest resource. And then lastly, there are some tensions here. There's a tension between volunteerism and donor engagement. If you look at volunteerism as a path to donations, you are probably going to have to approach this in a slightly different way. We don't. We actually completely explicitly separated the volunteer role from the donor role and try not to mix them. There's a tension between control and empowerment. Do you want your staff to retain control over decisions and implementation, or do you want to empower volunteers to have that kind of control? And then lastly, there's a tension between quality and quantity. So in summary, I think these 4 sources are a useful framework for how to differentiate the types of contributions that you need to have done, and then the strategy that you would use to tackle them. I hope we can have a robust Q&A here in the meeting, but in addition, if you want to continue this conversation afterward, I'd love to do it on Twitter, and I'd suggest the hashtag 4sources for a little while.